Hi, everybody. My name's Tony Lambert, and I'm here to get started talking about information stealers today. And I love seeing in the chat all of the things about about the video with the music at the beginning. And I just wanted to start out by saying that's the same video and the same music that we end up getting on our monthly updates, like whenever we do monthly update calls as a company. So I promise you, it goes just as hard on a Zoom call as it does on a webinar. This talk, Grand Theft Creds, kind of grew out of some topics where we explored a lot of things around stealers with our yearly threat detection report. And we wanted to provide a lot more information for the community to sort of level up everybody's defenses. And that's what we're going to get into today. First off, my name's Tony Lambert. I'm a senior malware analyst here at Red Canary. My day job is pretty much figuring out how to tear apart these different malware families, try to figure out, how we can identify them, how we can detect them better, and try to figure out if there's even ways that maybe we can throw a wrench in some of the bad guys' operations. I've been at Red Canary since about 2017, and all told, I've got over 15 years of experience in IT operations, general and security-wise as well. Got my education, different stuff up here because one of the slides look a little fancy. And on the side, I usually also do skill vault videos for the applied network defense folks to sort of teach a little bit of what attacks look like in the real world and try to pass that on to the next generation of security analysts. The topics we're going to talk about today are just a few quick items. We're going to talk about what stealers are. This is information stealer malware specifically. We're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about what some common capabilities are for these information stealers. We're going to talk about what they do, how they do it, and we're going to talk about which stealers are the most prevalent. There are new stealers every day. There is a bunch of malware that runs around in the wild. We're going to talk about the ones that Red Canary has seen the most in 2023. And we're going to talk about some detection and remediation advice around each of the stealers things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what are some maybe detection analytics you could look into and how you might be able to recover from these in your organization. To get started, I want to talk a little bit about just what are stealers in general. And information stealers are a kind of malware that is very concerned about sensitive information and secret. So if you think about all of the different things that you have on your system, you access bank accounts from your web browser. You may access Facebook or Twitter, different social media accounts. If you log into enterprise resources from your browser, you may have your Active Directory credentials saved in your web browser. A lot of folks do that sort of thing nowadays. If you're an IT administrator, you may use FileZilla or WinSCP, Slack or Discord, like different things like that. If you're a cryptocurrency user, you may use cryptocurrency wallets. All of these things are interesting in some way, shape, or form. And what stealers will try to do is they'll try to root out each of these items that are related to specific secrets, specific sensitive items, try to package them up, and they'll try to send them home to an adversary. And then from there, the adversary has to do something with them. The adversary may be able to use them themselves, or they can monetize them by selling them on a market somewhere. When we talk about who do stealers target, there are some stealers that are used by adversaries that target very specific demographics. For example, we have seen, well, I don't want to say we have seen, the community as a large has seen stealers used in all sorts of different areas of the world. Like stealers were used by adversaries in the Russia/Ukraine conflict. That is something where that was a very specific scenario. We see this opportunistically all the time. So it's not necessarily something that is always targeted. There are also very wide, broad nets where opportunistic adversaries will distribute stealers. And the folks that tend to be most at risk for this sort of thing fall into a few demographics. The ones that I think kind of fall into the most at-risk demographic tend to be engineers, administrators, things like that, because they usually have the keys to the kingdom for an enterprise network. It has definitely happened in the past where IT administrators or developers have a stealer on their system, and they end up losing credentials that may be saved in a web browser, passwords that are saved on their machine in a text file, keys, things like that. An adversary can turn those around and use those to gain further access into a network, further access to sensitive systems. For cryptocurrency consumers, if you happen to do a lot of stuff with Bitcoin, with Monero, with different cryptocurrencies, stealers are very concerned about those. Most stealers have some functionality in them to go and search for cryptocurrency wallets, things like that. And they'll start pulling back if you have credentials saved on your system to access those wallets. And they could turn around and use those to potentially get unauthorized transactions from cryptocurrency accounts. And there's also kind of a general consumer other category here where there are different stealers that have different motivations. Some stealers like Ducktail. Ducktail stealer was really concerned about Facebook business cookies because part of the way they would propagate their own stealer business model was by using Facebook business pages that were taken over from exposed cookies. There are some banking Trojan type stealers that are very concerned with banking accounts and all sorts of different things like that. So each stealer does have kind of its own target demographic sometimes, but it can, be very broad, very opportunistic. It can be very targeted. All right. So where do these people find stealers? I know I've run into problems in the past, like even as an IT admin or a malware analyst, like sometimes looking for trouble, I have trouble finding malware sometimes. So where do legitimate victims find this malware? What I've ended up finding is a lot of times they find it looking for specific software. If they are looking for premium software like Photoshop, something that usually is paid for, you may find that users in your organization look for cracked or free or pirated software that may have stealers bundled into them. Over here on the left-hand side of the slide, this is an example of that, of Magic SoundForge, where user happened to be looking for a cracked version of it, and instead they ended up getting a stealer. On the right-hand side, Blender is a free software product. This one particular user searched for Blender 3D on Google, and instead of going to the legitimate blender.org down there at the very bottom of the Google search list, they had all sorts of malicious advertisements available in Google there for them to start clicking on before they even get to the real stuff. And that is something that's continued to be a trend through 2023 into 2024. Malicious advertising, you'll often hear people kind of shorten that down to malvertising, is a very much a constant threat in 2024, where adversaries will imitate specific brands. They'll imitate things like Blender, or I've seen Asana, TradingView, different software brands to try to distribute malware instead of the actual legitimate software. In some cases, I've seen stealers distributed in fake software repositories. This is something that I've encountered on GitHub. I've encountered on Bitbucket. I have screenshots from GitHub here, but they are by far not the only ones with this problem. If you start searching for cracked software or different things like that over on code repositories, you'll often end up finding these fake repositories that have download links in them. And the user may say, I really want this aimbot, or I really want this video game cheat here. I'm going to go download this and apply it to my system. Congratulations, turns out you got malware instead of what you came for. This happens quite often across all the different code repository platforms. And sometimes what we've seen is even in third-party libraries like supply chain style, Nobody ever really wants to hear like there's a risk in using third-party libraries with different languages, but there really is. In some cases, like the left-hand side here, um, an adversary made a Python pip package, a third-party library, that was just a fake package that they made themselves and, and put malware into it. Over on the right-hand side, this was for NPM for Node.js. In that specific instance, the adversary cloned a popular package and then added in their own malware into that package instead of the legitimate functionality that was there. So we've seen both of those happen as a community. Um, we've also seen things like, some legitimate packages get taken over to do malware instead. Those don't happen nearly as often as some of these fake packages or clone packages. All right. Talking through that, wanted to cover what stealers can do. What are their actual capabilities? We talked a little bit about what they are and where you can find them, where you often encounter them. So let's understand the problem here of what they can actually do. And most of the time, the stuff that gets billed really the most frequently is stealers gather data from your web browsers, first and foremost. Um, Most of them support multiple web browsers, and usually they support browsers based on the flavor of the browser. If you have Chromium-based web browsers like Chrome, Edge, Opera, different things like those that are based on the Chromium platform, usually a stealer will have one set of functions for Chromium browsers and then just change out the names and say, since the file structure between these browsers is the same, let's just go look for everything that we know as Chromium on the system. The same sort of scenario happens with Gecko-based browsers. So Firefox, Pale Moon, other browsers that are along that flavor would be affected by potentially the same stealers. And when we see these stealers go after credentials, go after things inside the web browser, they usually parse out a bunch of things. They usually look for things like history, cookies, credentials, credit cards, sensitive form data, things like that. The data that is returned may change per stealer. It's not necessarily a consistent thing, just like there's diversity on the market in the legitimate market, there's diversity on the market among illegal goods and services. Um, Something I have also seen in latter part of 2023 into 2024, some of these cookies and some of the tokens that may be stolen from browsers may be used to do like a session reauthentication, like with Google OAuth, things like that. So these are potentially sensitive things that can affect a lot of users. And the last item there is extension settings. And think, well, okay, well, what extensions do I have? Why does this matter? If you have a cryptocurrency wallet, a lot of folks that use cryptocurrencies have cryptocurrency wallet extensions installed in their web browser. So it's not uncommon for stealers to search through the extensions installed on a system. And if they have credentials stored somewhere in those settings, to try to parse those settings and send the information home. In some cases, it's try to do the same with password managers. Like I think I've seen one try to do Authy and one try to do Bitwarden before. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. It just depends on the individual extension. They'll often target credentials in specific files. This is where that diversity of the market really kicks in, because some stealers will have dozens of applications they support getting credentials from, and then some will just do web browsers. So what I've seen a lot, and just the things that go across most stealers is most are concerned about things like FileZilla or WinSCP. These are going to be things like if you have an IT admin or an engineer, do they have common FTP or SSH sessions that they have saved in those applications? If so, let's grab those credentials and send them home. Fun fact, in FileZilla, whenever you save your credentials are saved in plain text in a XML file, and stealers will absolutely take advantage of that. For game clients, I've seen adversaries go after information from Steam and Discord specifically. They'll look for tokens, different things that will get them access to a Discord platform and credentials for Steam systems so they can turn around and sell those accounts. Uh, on the VPN side, if you happen to have things like NordVPN or commercial VPN services, I've seen some stealers will try to parse configuration files to pull passwords out of those. On the other side, if you use OpenVPN as a provider, usually OpenVPN, you can distribute packages that have certificates and keys and things in them instead of that username and password that you would have with commercial VPNs. I've seen some stealers searching for OVPN package files on systems to go and try to find all of these certificates or keys that are for a VPN, and someone would send those home and potentially sell those for someone else to have access to an enterprise. It's all sorts of details that are relevant with that with VPNs. And the last big thing is going to be miscellaneous files and different folders. It's kind of a generic thing, I know, but when we stop and think about human behavior, if you have a person who saves all of their password files in a spreadsheet, their passwords are probably, that password spreadsheet is probably going to be in their desktop or their documents or something like that that is very quick for them to go and access. People that write stealers know this, and they will absolutely write file grabber modules that go and enumerate all of your documents folders, all of your desktop folders, and go and look for things that may have password or key or certificate or something like that in the file name to indicate that there might be a secret inside. And that is something they'll definitely package up and send home. As the years have gone on, stealers have also adapted to different platforms. It's not just Windows software anymore. This is where adversaries have very much gotten used to the idea of having a diverse IT environment. If your IT environment has gotten more diverse, your bad guy has to get more diverse as well. They have to adapt to the times. This is something we saw in 2023 into the new year, as we've seen more macOS stealer activity. macOS stealers often go after the macOS keychain. That's simply because on macOS, that's where you end up having a lot of passwords and certificates saved. If you have certificates with private keys also saved in your keychain, that is a very juicy target for someone to go after, because they could, use all of that material to impersonate someone. Over on the Linux side, things that get more interesting there include SSH keys and cloud secrets. So if you happen to be using something like WinSCP or have saved SSH keys saved somewhere, those stealers are absolutely interested in going to find those. And then what they could potentially do is sell that information to third parties who can then go and use those keys to access a system or move laterally from Windows systems to another one if they know the systems that they're looking for. On the topic of the cloud secrets part, with some stealers, we've seen the capability to go and try to grab like AWS API keys from your individual engineering or your admin's configuration settings on their system. And that is something, again, that could be turned around for cloud access, where an adversary could log into a system and try to manage cloud resources. All of this is how actors have adapted to the new age. And when they go and they find all of this, they have to do something with it. The data is not really good to them unless they can take it home. So the way they usually take it home is they follow a procedure. They usually put it into some sort of archive, zip, RAR, something like that. They usually upload it to a system they control in some way. So this is going to be a server that maybe they have rented a VPS somewhere. They may have a Telegram channel or a Discord channel that they control. And as soon as they get it out into their hands, they can figure out how they want to monetize it. Do they use it themselves? Do they sell it to someone else? Do they put it on a market? All sorts of different stuff with that. For the zip archive part, the thing that I want to cover there is sometimes the zips are on disk, sometimes they're on memory. depending on the stealer that you're chasing after. Some families produce artifacts you can see on disk, some don't. It's just a matter of being able to kind of do some research on the individual malware and see how they work. All right. For the prevalence of stealers, there's a lot of stealers that happen in the wild. There are new stealers every day, but we want to kind of focus our efforts on the ones that are the most prevalent, simply because they're the ones we're most likely to see in the wild. And we're not the only ones that think stealers are a problem, because we're not the only people that track malware. If I look at Malware Bazaar, who is a free and open uh, malware system that gathers and aggregates malware all in one place, they've had tons and tons of submissions of stealer malware. The most prevalent ones tend to be things like Agent Tesla, Redline, Formbook, Loki. Those are the ones that were the most commonly submitted malware families to Malware Bazaar in 2023. So these stats are for the year 2023 for the entire year. CAPE is an open source sandbox system, and there's an instance of CAPE that that's open where people can upload things, and they very commonly see Redline, Formbook, Agent Tesla, things like those. The malware families are pretty consistent every year. Like Redline is almost always something that's up at the top. Agent Tesla or a clone of Agent Tesla is usually up towards the top somewhere, as well as Formbook. These are very popular stealers that operate in the wild, and it's not just us, it's the entire community. In fact, at one point, even CISA got a little bit of, or CISA or CISA, however you want to say it, they also got involved with some reporting. In 2021, they published a report of the most common malware families they observed. And I really wish they would have more up-to-date reports on some of the malware stuff. This was the most up-to-date one on the top malware families I could find. But out of the top malware families they saw, 4 or 5 of them were just stealers. Like the grand majority of the malware that they saw was just something that had a stealer component. It's not just someone who is trying to access and control the system, they're trying to take secrets home with them. For Red Canary specifically, in year 2023, we saw 4 stealers most prevalently. You may see it called Solar Marker or Jupiter Info Stealer in other reporting. We call the activity cluster related to that malware Yellow Cockatoo, because we started tracking it around the same time as some of the other folks that reported on it. That was probably the most prevalent one we saw for 2023, followed shortly after by Redline. Danabot, which is designed to be a little bit more of a financially focused stealer, was also in there, as was Ducktail. Ducktail was the one that I talked about previously that was really focused on Facebook business cookies, because part of their business model was being able to take Facebook business pages, turn those around, and then use those as malicious advertisements. No, said it before, I'll say it again, there are new stealers every day. I finished these slides last week. Each of these items that are on this slide came from the last week of April. And 2 new stealers over here for on the left-hand side that target Windows platform. On the right-hand side, Kanji published an article talking about a stealer for the macOS platform. So it's not just something that happens periodically. This is an everyday sort of scenario where when you start looking at social media, when you start going through some of those, it's not uncommon to see something new. All right, so we can get into the fun part here, which at the core that I love the most here is how can we detect some of the stealers? And we can really focus on this by identifying the specific attack path that is being used by adversaries. At the core of all of this, we have a very consistent attack pattern, which is they have to execute in some way. More often than not, there is some sort of defense evasion involved, something like process injection or something else like that to try to evade anti-malware defenses. They have to do credential access things to gather up their, to potentially unprotect sensitive information. A good example of that is to get credentials out of Windows systems on Chrome. You may have to do DP API unprotect commands, things like that. They have to gather up all of this information into an archive or some sort of material to send it home. And then they actually have to do the exfiltration process themselves. That is going to be calling home to Telegram, calling home to Discord, calling home to whatever server they support that is going to be, where they house their information. And each of these points, you can sort of bottleneck some things here where you can identify activity. And the first initial execution part that I wanted to talk about specifically was related around Danabot. With Danabot specifically, we saw suspicious curl command use in Windows 10 and beyond. Curl.exe is now a process you can use in Windows. Prior to Windows 10, if you wanted to use curl, you were pretty much a macOS or Linux user that is trying to adapt to the Windows lifestyle. Turns out on Windows 10 and above, that's a reality now. Danabot would also use JavaScript or VB script files to make network connections. And while we didn't observe this part with Danabot, we do observe it with other stealers, where sometimes we'll end up observing Python-based stealers making connections to Telegram or Discord immediately after they start executing to send status checks. So all of these are potentially detection analytic items that might be helpful in your organization, depending on how busy your organization is and the resources that you use. So I wanted to show an example of Danabot execution here. At the very top, our initial lure was a JavaScript file that was inside a zip. And what we've consistently seen with Danabot lures is they would use a first name, like first letter of the first name, last name, dash number pattern for the zip file. So for me, it would be T Lambert 70279.zip. And inside there would be a JavaScript file. I go double click on that file. And at the bottom, it runs a command there that does a few different things. It looks a little bit smushed together, but I've put kind of the steps that it takes out to the right. It does some actions to rename the curl command. It does this to sort of evade EDR controls, things like that. If you have naive controls that are just looking for curl.exe in the process name, this was how they get around it. They would try to download a PDF file that they launch, and whenever they start doing that download, immediately afterwards, they would open the PDF to distract you. You have a little bit of eye candy that's in front of you that you can focus on, and then behind the scenes, it downloads an additional payload and starts running that payload. So it was kind of an interesting thing to me at this point, where we could go look for detection analytics on renamed instances of curl executables, things like those. It was kind of interesting to me to see the distraction component of this, because in kind of years gone by, adversaries weren't as used to or didn't really concern themselves as much with trying to maintain a ruse after you double click their malware. You would double click the malware, nothing would happen, and then the user gets suspicious. Maybe I clicked something I shouldn't, they report it to IT. Something that is starting to become more common is adversaries will give you a little bit of the eye candy so that you are distracted, so that you think, oh, I may have just encountered a system error. I may have downloaded a document I wasn't supposed to have, things like that, to sort of distract you away from the fact that malware is going on. For the detection evasion opportunities for defense evasion, what we commonly see is adversaries, when they buy their stealers, when they buy their tools, they often also buy additional tools to try to protect the stealers. Because when you think about like how adversaries work here, they want to make sure their stealer can remain as active for as long as possible, and they want to make sure that it's not detected by Defender or other antivirus providers for as long as possible. So they'll go and they'll buy an additional product to protect that stealer and deploy it to a system. And usually the way those solutions work is that malware protection component will try to inject it into another process so that it looks less suspicious to a user. If you go and you open up Task Manager and you go to take a look at it, maybe you notice something is off, maybe it's not. You may see processes that are just legitimately named and you don't think twice about it. But really awesome, good security tools will be able to understand something is weird here, something's not right, because it has injection into the code. And the way we end up finding a lot of these is looking for suspicious process starts where the process starts up, and usually those processes are supposed to have command lines. Like, for example, here, ASP.NET compiler.exe. ASP.NET compiler is supposed to compile ASP code into binaries. If you don't give it a command line, it doesn't have anything to do. So obviously, that's going to be suspicious for us, especially if that has a network connection. So those are the kind of clues we try to dial in and look in for. And a good example of this is on this slide. And in this case, this is Rhadamanthus malware. Rhadamanthus has a bunch of different injection targets internally, one of which is dialer.exe. In certain cases, dialer.exe will get spawned with no command line options, and it will have network connections. And that's what we end up looking for as a solid detection analytic for Rhadamanthus. We've done the same thing with Redline and different families in the past. For credential access opportunities, usually there's a few different ways that we can go and look for these. If you're on a macOS system, what we commonly see there is an adversary prompting you for a password, because that adversary may want to use your password to do a sudo command on a macOS system. And for them to do that, they got to have the password. On the Windows side, the activity looks a little different. Some stealers will do file grabbing and send everything home, but some will try to process the stolen files on your system before it sends the information home. It's kind of that exercise in distributed computing. Is it better for me to process something on the endpoint or on the server side? In some cases, if the adversary chooses to process on the endpoint, they have to download DLLs to do so. Some of the most reliable ways that we found to go find Vidar, StealC, and other malware types like that, we would look for specific DLL downloads in a program data file or a program data folder for looking for those DLLs. Or for Raccoon in specific, it was app data local low folders. Those were very reliable for us to go find some of those stealers. And showing off what this looks like on the macOS side, what we see a lot with specifically Atomic Stealer, in other reporting you may call it, see it called AMOS, AMOS. In this case, Atomic Stealer masqueraded as a Calendly app that was supposed to be for macOS. And when the user double clicked on it, it would launch OSA script, which is an Apple script process, and it would try to go and prompt the user for a specific for their password, so they could record the password and then be able to reuse it with sudo commands. In between different versions of Atomic Stealer, that prompt, what you see the actual to launch the application, you need to update system settings. That prompt changes between versions of Atomic Stealer sometimes. So what we've seen them do is use this prompt, and we've seen some versions say passphrase instead of password to try to avoid detection analytics. For our collection things, again, remember, we're moving from execution, defense evasion, credential access into collection now. For collection opportunities, we're going to look for odd file modifications sometimes, or odd processes that look like they might be gathering files. Sometimes some stealers will have preset names for their file modifications. I want to think some older versions of Atomic Stealer or Mac Stealer, something like those, would use Google Chrome -cc to correspond to Google Chrome credit cards being written to disk, or keychain_passwords.txt to correspond to keychain passwords being stored to disk. If your organization has none of these file names being used legitimately most of the time, that's something that's potentially a high fidelity analytic that you could use in your particular organization. Sometimes, depending on the stealer name, they may have different names, but they may have certain file names in certain portions of file names being the same. So I've seen things like if a stealer is going after Chromium browsers, they may have Chrome passwords.txt, Opera passwords.txt, Edge passwords.txt, those sorts of things. So that is, again, something you can look into with detection analytics, looking for suspicious file modifications that may relate to passwords, something like cookies. One that we've used before to look for cryptbot stealers as well has been underscore files, because whenever cryptbot would go and stage all of its data before exfiltration, we ended up finding that in most instances, cryptbot would store all of them in a underscore files folder that was somewhere on disk before they started doing that zip process. That was something that was really high fidelity we could catch up to. And the example that I want to show here is again from macOS, is again from Atomic Stealer. As sometimes with newer stealers on macOS, instead of seeing suspicious file modifications, you may see suspicious Apple script processes trying to do file gathering. And in this case, I know it looks like this is a just massive wall of text. It's going to be a little bit difficult to read, but I've highlighted the important parts. And I'll make it a little bit easier to see here. If I blur out all of the overhead of AppleScript, and I just focus on the interesting parts, we can see this adversary is looking for cookies.binary cookies. This is a file that holds the cookies or web cookies for Safari on macOS. They're looking to duplicate the file notestore.SQLite. If you use Apple Notes on a macOS system, that is the SQLite database that holds all of your Apple Notes. In this case, our adversary was looking for all text, docx files, RTF, doc, wallet, keys, and key files that was in someone's desktop or documents folders. So going from this previous big wall of text, we can start searching for those keywords and saying, do we have any OSA script processes that reference cookies.binary cookies, and be able to go and dial in on specific macOS stealers in that fashion. It's something we've also encountered during this collection process. Apple has done great strides in recent years to use to implement something called transparency, consent, and control, or TCC. This is a security control that prompts your user if certain applications are trying to access sensitive information. It will give your user an allow or don't allow, kind of like UAC on Windows platforms. And what users will often see in the case of stealers on macOS is a prompt something like the left-hand side here, where terminal wants to access Finder and starts telling Finder to do all of its file modifications. This was an interesting way that some malware, or that Atomic Stealer and some other stealers have tried to get around EDR controls. Instead of doing the file modifications themselves, they're telling the Finder application on macOS to go and do the file modifications on its behalf to sort of throw off those detection analytics. And if you're not familiar with Finder, it's the kind of not exact equivalent, but the analog of Windows Explorer on the macOS system. So it's a sort of similar thing. And because these TCC prompts pop up, if your user clicks OK and they may need to click through them and allow the malware to run, because remember, we've all been conditioned to click things a little bit too freely. If they click OK, that might be something that needs to go into your response process. If you have a lot of macOS systems on your network, do you also need to reset TCC databases to make sure that your user has to get prompted again? For exfiltration, folks usually focus a lot on the network controls, but we can still focus on some things from the endpoint perspective. We see adversaries using messaging or pasting sites a lot, so things like pastebin, paste.e, like the domain that ends in .ee, Discord, Telegram, things like that. If they're not using Discord, Telegram, some of those, if they're using their own web infrastructure, they often use HTTP post requests so that they can sort of push up information to their systems. If you're using network security controls that parse HTTP post requests, this is something that you could probably hunt for in network traffic. And depending on specific stealers, if you're worried about specific stealers, you can even do suricata rules or things like that along with your network controls to catch up to some of these. And a good example of this was Ducktail from last year. In this particular case, Ducktail was doing either a status check or a exfiltration, one or the other. This was something that we couldn't tell the difference between with EDR because we didn't see what data was taken. However, we could definitely tell that there was a connection to Telegram. So when an adversary uses a messaging service like this inside their malware, usually they do it for one of two reasons. They want either a status update to say, I have a new victim, or they want to use the data storage of it to say, here's the new victim, here's their information, go profit. So in this case, we ended up seeing a suspicious binary. This was posing as a job posting, as like a resume sort of thing. And whenever the user ran it, whenever our victim ran it, it started talking to Telegram to send information. And this is something that's potentially good analytic for some organizations. If you happen to not use Telegram at your organization, this all floats back to kind of know your network, know yourself. If you don't use Telegram, if you don't use Discord, if you don't use things like those may be relatively decent fidelity analytics that you could use in your organization to go find malicious activity. All right, we have talked about how to do some detection and all of this. Let's talk about fixing the damage. We've identified that bleeding is happening. Let's actually stop the bleeding and see if we can get back to normal. Before we start panicking with any sort of response, the first thing we have to do is scope. We have to figure out the scope of the information required in the incident and what assets were involved, and then figure out what our commitments are, what we have to do. So we want to know what credentials may have been stored on the system at the time the stealer executed. This may need to be, you talk to your user, talk to your victim, take a look at their web browser. What credentials do they have stored in that web browser? If they have 20 credentials stored in there, we may have to assume all 20 of those credentials were exposed. So we have to go and reset those. If the victim had specific files related to tax things, their passwords or other people's passwords in a file on disk, things like those, they may have to be reset. If they have credentials for bank accounts, if they have credit card information saved in their browsers, those may also be something that need to be looked at. To do our reset and monitoring phase, when we've identified all of our credentials that have been affected, these are going to be your enterprise credentials, these are going to be bank account credentials, all of the passwords or keys that may be stored. We have to go and reset those credentials. That may be rotating passwords. It may also involve rotating keys, like encryption keys, things like that. If you're using SSH keys and those keys were exposed, you may have to reissue the SSH keys. In some cases, this may involve personal accounts as well as your business accounts. If you're a business and your victim has individual personal accounts, you may not be able to govern what they're doing with those accounts, and you just have to advise them, we strongly think that you should reset these accounts. That's something that has to be their individual responsibility. If there are financial accounts involved, you may have to start monitoring for suspicious activity. If there were specific business-related credit cards that were exposed or login credentials for a business account, you may have to go and take a look at the transactions for those accounts and make sure nobody is getting unauthorized access after you do the resets. Oh, and one thing to also mention here that I forgot. Something in kind of the new cloud age that we have observed, in some cases, it's not enough to simply reset credentials. You may also have to revoke sessions. This has been really a thing among cloud service providers. So if you have Entra AD or Azure AD, depending on which name you like to use, you may have to go back and manually revoke that user's login. So if they have any sessions already logged in, kick those sessions out and then do your password resets. All right. So in some cases, we may need to know, do we have regulated data that's maybe involved with this? Let's say that you're working in a hospital environment and a stealer executes on one of your medical records, one of your coders' systems, something like that. You may have to take stock and say, is there any information related to healthcare records on this person's system? Could that be a HIPAA finding? Do we have to report that to a government organization? Do we have to potentially pay fines on this sort of thing? And you may have to, talk to your legal folks and figure out what your commitments need to be. In talking about all of this, I don't want any of this to kind of be a fear-mongering sort of situation. I want this to be a good sort of educational experience. And the biggest takeaways here to close up is stealers happen all the time. It's not just something that is targeted to one particular industry. It's not something that is targeted at one particular group of users. Everyone across the larger security community has observed this. Everyone has run into these problems. And if it happens to your organization, you're not alone. You're not the only one. The good thing about all of this is, despite them being really prevalent, really opportunistic, they can be detected a lot of different ways. If you have endpoint technologies, you can go take a look at endpoint detection analytics and go find them where they live. If you have network technologies, things like Suricata, different things like those, you can definitely find the same thing or find similar things with network controls as you do on the endpoint side. Even if you have all sorts of defense in place, where I feel like organizations will be set apart here is going to be their response. If you have a proper response scenario set up, that is how you can make your organization resilient. The more you have your response thought out, the more prepared you are to be able to do account resets, revoking sessions, things like that, being able to boot out adversaries and change your infrastructure in a timely manner. That is going to set your organization apart from someone who really struggles with this threat. And it's something that, unfortunately, we only learn as we get better and as we respond to more of it. All right. So that is the takeaways that I have for all of this. And I wanted to kind of open it up to Q&A. So I'll take a couple of seconds to look through the Q&A box here. We already have some questions in here. If you have any questions from the webinar so far that you want to ask, go ahead and toss those into the Q&A and we'll get to what we can here in the next few minutes. And let's see. All right, so one person asked, is a stealer placed like a rootkit, or is it something more visible that can be seen in Process Monitor or Task Manager? The answer to that is it depends. Usually the difference between a rootkit and stealer malware is going to be that a rootkit has the capability to fool the operating system into thinking it doesn't exist. As stealer, depending on the software your adversary has chosen to use to protect their stealer, they may blend in with the rest of process manager or process monitor activity or task manager, you may not be able to see that it is there or recognize that it is there, but it may not be hidden from the operating system the same way a rootkit would be. So generally, it the reason I say it depends is because it can be hidden from the operating system. More likely than not, it's still visible. It just is masqueraded as a different name. All right. So one question, one person asked, what do the lines on the 2023 stats slide represents? This was this one. So these lines kind of correspond with the most common ones that we saw. So we saw yellow cockatoo. The most common, red line was second most common, Danabot third, and ducktail fourth. These are the four most common that we saw for 2023. So the lines are just literally, related to each other in prevalence here. As for specifically how many instances of yellow cockatoo did we see, I am not sure offhand, but it was in our top 10, and it was prevalent enough that if you go take a look at our yearly threat detection report, it made the top 10 in that report, and there's an article about it in there. All right. One question was, how effective is MFA on multi-factor authentication against an attempt of an attack using Stealer malware? All right, so this is a really awesome question, and this leans into a little bit of that response, a little bit of response and preparation. So when we think of how do these credentials get used, an adversary may take their credentials and may use them themselves, or an adversary may go and sell them. If the adversary goes and sells them, they're usually sold at like a black market sort of scenario. Someone else buys them and uses them to gain initial access into an organization. When you see initial access or like valid accounts used on a MITRE attack technique heat map, that's what they usually mean, is a valid account is purchased somewhere then used. So in the cases of multi-factor authentication, that does limit what an adversary can do with the accounts. If the user has a multi-factor authentication device enabled, when that adversary logs in, it's going to prompt that specific user, is this you? Check yes or no. If you have Okta or Duo or whatever else. Now, adversaries have learned to work around some of this. Some adversaries will do targeted phishing to try to do adversary in the middle phishing attacks, where they can potentially capture MFA things or do SIM swapping. If your multi-factor authentication involves SMS or like text messaging, some adversaries will try to do SIM swapping to sort of bypass some of that. And one evergreen technique that adversaries use to bypass MFA is simply MFA exhaustion. They'll keep on logging in until that user gets tired of hitting no, it's not me at 3 o'clock in the morning and simply hit yes, leave me alone instead. Let's see. Has anyone implemented canaries for stealers? I can think of a few ways to do this, but have you seen particular success with specific kinds of honey creds? So I love this question because I was actually talking to someone about deception technologies this morning. Deception technologies like canaries are very commonly used in organizations as an early warning system for if you have an adversary doing something weird and all of your other detection methodologies have failed. So let's imagine that you have a credential that is never logged in with. Let's say you have T Lambert as an account. Nobody ever logs into T Lambert, not even me. And if anyone logs in on that account, it is immediately understood to everyone across the organization. Someone that is doing that is up to no good. Let's go sound all the sirens and go see what's up. I've heard some organizations have very great success with canaries, not just canary accounts, but canary accounts, canary files, things like that. Because as adversaries get more advanced, the different things that they can do often evade detection analytics. You may have a specific set of things. You may have a specific subset of detection analytics that are really targeted for your organization that hit everything. as your adversary gets more advanced, grows, their playbook gets different. They may be able to evade all of this. And if you don't have anything to capture them in your detection analytics, that canary is going to be what gives you that early warning that something has happened and you didn't have anything else for them. And as for the implementation part, there are ways in, let's say if you have Active Directory at home, or at home at your organization, you could potentially have a Canary account in Active Directory. And I want to think there was a way to do a scheduled task if that is triggered specifically when that account logs in to go and notify someone. All right. So trying to go through the rest of them here. Do you find the stealers will use the temporary files from Notepad++ to open creds or code? I have not encountered that so far. Usually the ones that are most common are things like FileZilla, WinSCP, Steam, Discord, VPN clients. I've seen Pigeon and Trillion instant messaging clients. I want to think with Notepad and Notepad++, there are ways to potentially get those, but I haven't seen them specifically targeted in the past. And there was one also question I wanted to get to. This probably might be the last one that we have time for. So this was for the macOS side. If you have a macOS stealer, how effective can the stealer be if the user doesn't provide a password when prompted? So that's an awesome question where it kind of goes into the idea of like, what's the risk of the stealer running and it doesn't run successfully? It depends on how that stealer is implemented. In the case of Atomic Stealer, what they would be able to do is they would be able to still grab some information like files off of a system, but they may not be able to issue sudo commands. So they may not be able to access some parts of the file system to get files from, or they may not be able to change some settings on the system to make stealing easier. They may not be able to go after a person's keychain, for example. They might still be able to get other things, but they may not be able to get everything. All right. So we're just about up on the hour here. So I believe that is all we've got for the afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining in, and thanks for all the awesome questions. I always love to see the questions because the questions are always a good marker of engagement of how well some of this content has hit home. So all of you, when you ask questions, it hits me right in the heart. So thanks everybody for joining in.